For someone with narcissistic traits, the fear of imperfection often leads to the belief that anything less than perfect is catastrophic. Remember this whole thing about splitting and all or nothing mentality. To work with such projections tactfully and authentically, you first need to tolerate the fierceness and intensity of your loved one's feelings without reacting prematurely. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we're continuing our deep dive into the world of vulnerable narcissism, an incredibly important topic because vulnerable narcissism is not just a type of narcissism, but a significant thread that weaves through every form of narcissism, including grandiose narcissism. If you've been following along, you know that in prior episodes, I defined vulnerable narcissism, explored its underlying dynamics, and explained how it can be understood as someone whose primary goal is to have others support, take care of, or fulfill their intense emotional neediness. In our last conversation, we began focusing on strategies for relating to and supporting someone who struggles with these traits. How do you connect with someone like this? How do you navigate a relationship with someone who's incredibly sensitive and feels deeply wounded by any attempt to offer feedback or give them advice? We covered, if we could call it this, step one of relating to someone like this in detail. The act of containment, what we refer to as metabolizing and detoxifying the projection. And I broke that down in the prior episode. In short, this involves taking in another's overwhelming emotions and transforming them into something manageable. I mentioned it's like cooling down a hot potato before handing it back to them. Containment allows us to hold space for their emotions by pausing, reflecting, and using, and I quote, empathy to create a thoughtful response. True empathy is not just, oh, that sounds so horrible, or, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. No, true empathy involves deeply understanding their perspective, which can regulate and calm them far more effectively than just surface level reassurance. So in other words, true empathy helps them become more regulated and less conflicted. We explored how containment helps shift someone from a transactional mindset. This mindset, which I referred to in prior episodes as, and I quote, the literal mode of communication, is characterized by statements like, I need you to do whatever, something. You could fill in the blank here for me. In other words, literally take care of me. Containment helps move them toward the representational mode where deeper emotional processes occur. This approach avoids reinforcing a sense of helplessness. Also, I want to make clear, if you're listening to this and recognizing that you may be the vulnerable narcissist in this scenario, or that you have these characteristics, let's say, the first step of containment can be incredibly valuable for you too. By engaging in reflective listening and asking yourself questions about your own emotional state, you're learning to take a step back and process your feelings without immediately relying on others to meet your needs or tell you how to live your life, which job you should take, for instance. This practice helps to reduce the urgency of your demands, allowing you to regulate your own emotions and not become immediately reactive. So, okay, that was a quick review. Where do we go from here? Today, I want to move forward and delve into the next step of containment. To do that, we need to ask another essential question. What is the primary goal of someone who's struggling with these vulnerable narcissistic characteristics? In part, it's about drawing others in to provide support, care, and attention to fill in the intense feelings of neediness, much like a neglected child desperately seeking assistance from a distracted, preoccupied, maybe a depressed caregiver. In many ways, this dynamic keeps the vulnerable characteristics locked into a perpetual childlike state, reliant on others to meet their needs and reenacting early caregiving relationships. It is this, and I quote, reenacting, that's the creation of a sense of urgency and a rescue response from others that we need to focus on today. This idea of reenactment leads us to the second key aspect of containment, clarifying the person's experience, and I quote again, in the moment. That's the most important piece here that I want to focus on. After the first stage of containment, which includes the enhanced definition of empathy that I've discussed, if you sense that the vulnerable person in your life is beginning to hear you, you can gently guide them to explore their own emotions in the moment. Let's return to the example we've been using. Though you can adapt this to any situation relevant to your own experience with somebody who has these vulnerable narcissistic characteristics. In our case, a spouse assumes you will wake up early and prepare breakfast for them. In this second step, again, if we could call it that, like we're doing these steps, we're going over the steps because reaching this type of person is very difficult. So there has to be some sort of process to it. So in this second step of containment, you might wonder to yourself if cooking breakfast equates to feeling cared for or loved. However, it's too much of a leap to immediately make this connection, as doing so could escalate the emotional charge of the conversation rather than fostering understanding. It might be better to reframe this sentiment into a reflective question that explores the connection without making a dramatic assumption. Almost like you're taking, and I quote, a guess, right? You're guessing at the problem. A guessing is part of containment, but it's also a demonstration that you're trying to understand somebody rather than just assuming that you know what they're feeling. So let me give an example of this. Do you feel that my waking up early to cook will help you feel a little bit more supported or cared for? If so, I'd like to understand that better so we could find a way forward. Okay, again, as always, I'm not trying to script you, but the main goal of this second step is to start naming the underlying longing for connection in the moment. Naming this longing helps shift the focus from the surface level demand to the deeper emotional need, creating an opportunity for meaningful dialogue. Additionally, if you can validate their longing by saying something like, it makes sense that you would want that. See, that's very validating. And that creates a safer space now for them to engage with their feelings verbally rather than simply seeking to have their need met in a more direct, transactional way. You may have noticed the emphasis on making this and again, I quote here, collaborative effort. I'm trying to emphasize that. This part can be challenging, especially if you're experiencing a strong emotional reaction yourself. However, when I use this approach with the narcissistic patients in my practice, I stay engaged with them not in an angry or a reactive way, but with understanding and reflection. It may take a lot for you to imagine and understand that your loved one isn't just being manipulative. You hear that so much in the social media content, that the narcissist is so manipulative. On the surface, it may seem like manipulation. However, if you recognize it as an expression of an unmet need, and again, I quote the literal mode, something I spoke about in more detail in prior episodes, basically a mode of just trying to get you to take care of them. So if you could see it that way, unmet needs that are communicated in a literal mode of interaction, it becomes clearer to you what they're doing. They become either dysregulated or conflicted about sharing their genuine needs and therefore struggle to convey their true emotions. Instead, what you see is they try to get their needs met in an unhealthy way. Understanding this, from my perspective at least, helps me stay in a more regulated and grounded state so that I can ask those inquisitive, reflective questions. But what happens when the conversation escalates into confrontation? How do we keep our cool and stay grounded when the emotional intensity ramps up? At this point, the conversation may take on a more confrontational or accusatory tone. You might hear something like this, and again, fill in the blank. You never support me. Why can't you just think about me and make my breakfast? Or, when you try to help, you're not doing it right. What's the matter with you? In these moments, it can feel like they're escalating their demands while dismissing your perspective. So, how do we respond in a way that maintains containment, fosters understanding, and avoids making the situation worse? Okay, so this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. A key aspect of containment is to recognize, validate, and then explore their emotional experience. Again, I quote, in the moment. We want to keep it in the here and now in terms of what's going on between the two of you. That is the piece we are adding today, in the moment. Recognizing, empathizing with, and containing the anxieties around genuine connectedness is a necessary and important first step. However, we have to keep in mind that while there is a pressing need and a desire to be understood, this very need may be accompanied by a paradoxical resistance to being understood. In fact, they may seem to despise the idea of being understood, attempting to disavow it and push away any real contact with you. One way to understand this pushback is as a profound shame tied to the genuine need for connection, where needing others feels like an unbearable weakness or failure, which, by the way, is very common across all different types of narcissism. And that's the way that all these different types blend into one another. This shame, of course, we've been over this before, but review is always helpful. This shame, which is rooted in early experiences of unmet needs or rejection, makes the act of being understood threatening rather than comforting. Instead of allowing themselves to accept this understanding, they may push it away, disavowing the vulnerability it reveals. What we often see on the surface is a defensive reaction, overt hostility, contempt. There's the grandiosity, which is all of these things are compensatory, or an intensified sense of helplessness. Again, compensatory. It compensates for these much deeper feelings, such as shame or the longing for genuine connection. This is why containment and empathy alone are not always sufficient. There must be a balance between pulling back to help regulate the intensity of the demand that they're placing on you and a pushing forward with painful understanding and insight. In other words, what's going on right here in the moment? What's happening? This insight is necessary for growth, in my perspective. This is all still about step 2. This is where we start to bring in insight rather than just being empathic and containing and detoxifying. Okay, with this in mind, let's return to how one might respond to the escalating comments such as, "You never support me. Why can't you just think about me and make the breakfast?" Or, "When you try to help, you're not doing it right. What's the matter with you?" or you fill in the blank here because you've been in this situation before, I'm sure. And there are many different iterations of this escalating conflict. What if you respond? Okay, I'm asking you to hold on to your seats now because you may be a little surprised by this or put off, but I want you to entertain this idea. What if you respond to these provocations with a quick acknowledgement of fault? Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to. Imagine your partner saying something like, I told you last week I like my eggs scrambled, not fried. Again, I'm just making this up, but you can fill it in with whatever is most relevant and resonates with you. But, so here's the twist. They say something like that, but in the heat of the moment, you overlook this detail, thinking you're meeting their need by simply preparing the meal, for instance. In this case, I hope you can appreciate that their frustration comes not just from the act itself, but from the perception that their previous request wasn't heard or valued. That's the key point right there. What if, in the heat of the moment, you simply say, you're right. Perhaps I didn't hear how you wanted it done, or something like that. It might feel like an easy way to calm things down, but could this actually make the situation better and lead to the growth that I'm referring to and the insight that I just mentioned before, all of which are part of step 2?
Create Harmony is a podcast about setting an intentional rhythm and savoring God's blessings. In this place, we'll take a few minutes to celebrate everyday joys and remind ourselves how to notice goodness that is all around us. During the winter at Create Harmony, we shift our focus to all things cozy and snuggly. And while our days are shorter and darker, we stay attuned to the things that help us reset and restore. At the start of this new year, our podcast is filled with winter self-care as well as ways to declutter and clear your mind. Check it out.
The key here is to acknowledge that there may be more beneath the surface. She may have made only a passing reference about how she likes her eggs cooked. But this is where this second key aspect of containment comes in. Staying in that, and again, I quote, moment with the projection, right? You as incompetent or incapable, initially might involve acknowledging fault and expressing that you didn't fully grasp the painful experience of rejection that your partner feels. In other words, you don't have to say this, but you have to grasp that that they are feeling incredibly rejected. For them to complain about something so small or insignificant as the way you prepared a meal, you have to begin to wonder what more is going on here. And then if you're in your own regulated state of mind, you have to begin, if you can, you may want to try to say, this was very painful, that they felt deeply rejected. This technique carries an implicit function. It shows that a person can be imperfect and still continue to exist and function without falling apart. And again, that's your acknowledgement, that quick acknowledgement of fault. You're modeling something there. For someone with narcissistic traits, the fear of imperfection often leads to the belief that anything less than perfect is catastrophic. Remember this whole thing about splitting and all or nothing mentality. To work with such projections tactfully and authentically, you first need to tolerate the fierceness and intensity of your loved one's feelings without reacting prematurely. So, I'll give you an example. In my work with individuals who present with these narcissistic traits, I focus on containing and processing their projections. These projections often reflect deeply ingrained self-representations. That's internalized beliefs about themselves that are shaped by early experiences and emotional wounds. I'm sorry, I know that's a lot, but what I'm doing is I'm just sharing with you that in my work, as part of processing projections, that I reflect, that I know that this is about self-representations, okay? The beliefs about themselves. And it may have something to do with me. That's why it's important to reflect and acknowledge if I overlook something. But the focus is on the self-representations. These self-representations can be overwhelming for both the individual and those around them as they influence how they interpret and respond to the world. The goal is to use the projection of these representations as building blocks for deeper discussion. So I see this more as an opportunity rather than a frustration. By acknowledging the intensity of their projections, I can help the individual explore how their internal world, shaped by these representations, influences their responses and interactions with others. Again, that's the opportunity that I was just referring to a moment ago. We have to remember that these projections are often unconscious. They're an attempt to manage feelings. Remember I said this before, of what? Shame or inadequacy or intense feelings of rejection, like in this example that I'm giving, such as what? You didn't hear how I like my eggs prepared. You didn't hear me. And that's deeply wounding. By processing these projections in the moment with the patient or with the person in your life, we can begin to unpack the emotional significance behind them. But how can we manage these projections in the moment? While I can accept fault if I genuinely fail to appreciate how rejected they might feel, how can I meaningfully influence the way they interact with me and others? Let me give you a few examples to illustrate this process, and perhaps this will make it a little bit clearer in your mind. Let's stay with the example of having missed something about the way she likes her eggs cooked. Initially, I said that I would recognize that I missed something, but what if she made only a passing reference about how she likes her eggs prepared? Once the situation calms down, and it seems both parties, that's right, I mean you as well, are open to further discussion, I might say something like this. Again, and I'm not trying to script you here. You can fill this in with whatever words are appropriate in whatever relationship you're in. It's possible you did tell me this and I missed it. But is it also possible you couldn't tell me directly? Or you could say something like, could there be another way this could have been communicated more clearly? Or perhaps there was something about that moment that made it harder to bring it up directly. See, in essence, what I'm getting at is it's possible that you didn't hear it and you recognize that, but it's also possible that they said something in passing, that there wasn't emphasis placed on it. And if that's the case, or if they said it at a moment when you were preoccupied or you were doing something, if that's the case, that's a really important piece of this. Because you have to begin to wonder, why was it not communicated more clearly? And that's what I'm beginning to raise with these inquisitive questions. And you could come up with your own questions. These may not be the best words. And as always, I'm not trying to be overly prescriptive. The main point, for example, if I encountered this with a patient in my practice, I would stay alert to and be curious about the roles being cast. The patient casts the self as someone whose needs are ignored. Like for instance, nobody listens to me. And they cast you, or me in this example, right, as the person who doesn't care to listen. In object relations theory, that's a psychoanalytic theory. This is known as the dominant object relationship, which is always activated in everyday life situations. Another way to express this might be to say, it sounds like you're experiencing me as, and again, you could fill in the blank here, given your own situation with this, but like someone who will push you away. Or in this specific example that we're looking at, have you ever noticed how often you see and experience me as someone who fails to care for you and meet your needs? Anyway, The reason I'm sharing this with you is that it's crucial for understanding how these patterns play out in the moment, both in your relationships with these individuals, and I'm giving an example of my work with them as well. When we identify the roles a person has assigned to themselves, right, or to us, we can start to work with these projections. This allows us to engage more reflectively and thoughtfully, helping them explore and shift their internalized beliefs. By naming and addressing these dynamics, we create space for them to reframe their experiences. I've mentioned several times that there are steps, that's what I keep saying, to relating to and helping someone struggling with this type of narcissism. The approach I'm describing now sets the stage for what will come later. For example, eventually, I might help them realize that they, not their spouse, are the one cutting off communication by getting angry and attacking him for making the eggs incorrectly. At this point in the process, however, this is not something they can consider. It would feel like they are being blamed, accused, judged, or slighted in some way. There's still more work to be done to get to that next point, and I'll detail that work in a future episode. But for now, we have to start wrapping things up. But in the service of review, for where we are now in terms of the steps, the appropriate response when I hear a story like this, at least initially, is to focus on how awful she must have felt when he seemingly ignored her request and handed her the wrongly prepared meal. If I sense I'm being heard, I would then guess, which is still part of containment, that she might have thought that he didn't really care about what she wanted and that he wasn't listening to her very carefully. Finally, by identifying and reflecting on the roles individuals assign to themselves and to you, others, we can begin to work with these projections, helping them shift their internalized representations, that's just their internalized beliefs, and reframe their experiences. I did not comment on her aggressive attack, nor did I address how, perhaps, it felt like the only way she could feel better was by humiliating and yelling at him while insisting he was a bad or inadequate partner. If you want to hear about how to get to that step, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any upcoming episodes on this and other topics related to narcissistic traits and relationship dynamics. Thanks for listening. As always, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or feedback that you may have. Until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.